This is a regretful day in this chamber. This chamber that has, before today, prioritized the strength of our public universities. This chamber who, in the past, has allocated billions of dollars into the Texas University Fund to ensure that our state remained, quote, intellectual capital of the world. And I stand before you in opposition to this legislation that goes contrary to the votes of this chamber to support and uphold our public schools of thought. Legislation that threatens to defund our public universities for working towards our stated goals of 60% by 30. Today's a regretful day for those of us in this body that in 2015 pledged to, quote, vault the standings of our public colleges and universities into top ranks. This legislation unravels the investment that this legislature has made to public colleges over generations, investments that have taken our state to hold the largest number of Tier 1 and Tier 2 research universities in this nation. This legislation threatens those victories all out of what? Fear of diversity? Fear of equity, of inclusion? Do we fear these three because we perceive a threat? A threat to what? A threat to whom? Diversity is not a threat. Equitable access to education is not a threat. Inclusion is not a threat. We turn our cheek away from the real threats that our communities face. The threats of gun violence, threats of poverty, housing insecurity, the threat of illiteracy. Not even a generation ago, men in positions of power used institutional violence for political and educational control. Mexican Americans, Black Texans, and other communities have been terrorized, abused, neglected, and wrongfully profiled for decades in this state. And why are we back at square one? After all of the civil rights victories that we have overcome and won, this legislation is rolling us back to a time when not even water fountains were equally accessible. Let's be honest, because this legislation is telling us that Texans fear diversity. This legislation shows us that folks are so afraid of inclusive practices in public universities that they're willing to go as far as defunding our public universities. And yet we sit here with each other as colleagues, looking at each other in our eyes, working side by side, while voting for legislation that hurts students who look like me, students who look like our colleagues. The choice we are being offered here is clear. We are either supporting equality through diversity or punishing it, censoring it, suppressing it. And I ask you to reflect on what DEI practices means. What is the absence of diversity? The absence of diversity is white supremacy. The absence of equity is inequality. The absence of inclusion is segregation. This legislation cuts our legs from underneath us and blames us for not standing taller. Is the goal of this legislation to curtail the increasing number of young Latinos and Black students enrolling and graduating from public universities? This legislation punishes students looking to pull themselves up by their bootstraps for needing a little extra support. This legislation defunds public universities who look to provide that support, and I ask you to consider the harmful effects of what defunding these universities means for helping the least of these. And that's why I oppose this legislation.